What if the woman they fired secretly owned the entire company? Meet Claire Delaney, a quiet powerhouse forced out by a sexist boss who had no idea she held 90% of the company's shares. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about strategy, resilience, and reclaiming what's rightfully yours. If you've ever been underestimated, this story will hit home. Like, comment, and subscribe for more empowering stories where quiet women rise and take the whole table with them. I was halfway through reviewing the quarterly sales data when Nathan Calloway stormed into my office without knocking. No courtesy, no warning, just a loud, deliberate entrance clearly meant to rattle me. Typical Nathan. "Claire," he barked, tossing a thick folder onto my desk like it was beneath him. "We need to talk." Now. I glanced at the file, then looked up at the man who had technically been my superior for the past 4 years. Nathan had never been the type to acknowledge the women around him unless they were fetching his dry cleaning or managing his overbooked calendar. He liked authority, and even more than that, he liked reminding people that he had it. I remained calm, like always. "Of course," I said, gesturing to the guest chair in front of my desk. He didn't sit. Instead, he loomed over me with the smug air of someone enjoying his moment a little too much. "The board's decided to restructure the leadership team," he began, his tone flat. "We're going in a different direction. And frankly, we need people who can lead, not just keep track of spreadsheets." I blinked once, processing the implication. "You're firing me?" I asked, steady but stunned. Nathan smirked like he'd just closed $1 million deal. "Let's not be dramatic. We're releasing you from your position, effective immediately." There was no performance review, no discussion, no acknowledgement that my department had just delivered the highest revenue growth in 3 years. "May I ask why?" I said, voice still level. He didn't hesitate. "You lack vision. You manage tasks, not people. And honestly, this industry requires confidence, assertiveness, presence. Qualities you haven't exactly shown." It wasn't even subtle. A pointed dismissal dressed up in corporate buzzwords and gender-coded language. I knew then it wasn't about results. It was about perception. "I understand," I replied, calm and composed. Nathan clearly expected outrage, maybe even tears. What I gave him, nothing. "We'll need your badge and company laptop by 5, he added. "HR will handle your severance." I stood, extended my hand, and said simply, "Thank you for the clarity." He shook it, visibly unsure how to react to my composure. As he walked out, satisfied with his little power play, I sat back down and exhaled slowly. My hands didn't tremble, my pulse didn't race. What Nathan didn't know, and what no one in that building yet understood, was that 2 weeks ago everything had changed. And now, I was just waiting for the right moment to act. The office felt quieter than usual as I gathered my things. Too quiet. Like everyone already knew something had happened, but were pretending they didn't. I moved deliberately, not rushing, not hesitating, just placing a few personal items into the same recycled cardboard box they probably kept in HR for moments like this. A framed photo of my parents, a ceramic mug from last year's holiday party, and a stack of worn notebooks filled with ideas and project outlines that had rarely made it past Nathan's desk. Outside my office, a few colleagues glanced my way with the kind of practiced sympathy that people use when they're afraid of catching someone else's misfortune. No one said anything, and I didn't expect them to. I walked past the rows of cubicles, down the long hallway lined with abstract art that someone in marketing once said promoted creativity, and out into the sunlit plaza without a single word spoken to me. 15 years. That's how long I'd given to that company, through mergers, recessions, product failures, and leadership changes. And now I was being escorted out, not with thanks, not with recognition, but with silence and a locked-out email account. But even as the doors closed behind me, I didn't feel bitter. I felt lighter. Because what Nathan didn't know, what no one else could have guessed, was that he hadn't fired someone helpless. He'd fired the majority shareholder. 2 weeks earlier, in a paneled office uptown, I had opened a sealed envelope left behind by my father, a man who built the company from a single regional operation into a national player before retiring and passing away a few years later. He had always believed in planning for the long game. The envelope, which I was legally barred from opening until I turned 30, contained a letter in his handwriting and a notarized trust document placing 90% of his retained shares in my name, fully active on my 30th birthday. I had opened it alone, with shaking hands and 1,000 questions. But only one answer mattered: I owned the company now. Not figuratively. Not metaphorically. Legally. Completely. I remembered the exact moment I'd opened the envelope. It was early morning, the kind of stillness that only exists before the city wakes up. I sat alone at the kitchen table in my apartment, the same spot where my father used to sip coffee, and scan the Wall Street Journal on Sunday mornings, and I stared at the heavy envelope with my full name written in his steady, unmistakable handwriting. Claire Margaret Delaney. No middle initials, no abbreviations. He had always been intentional, even about the smallest details. The instructions were simply: do not open until the morning of your 30th birthday. And so, I hadn't. Not even once in 5 years. The letter inside was short, but every word mattered. Claire, it began. If you're reading this, you've turned 30, and that means you're ready. I read it 3 times, barely breathing. You've spent most of your life proving your worth in places that were never designed for you to succeed. You worked twice as hard for half the credit, and I've watched quietly, knowing the time would come when you'd need more than determination. You'd need leverage. So, I left you the table. Not just a seat at it, the whole damn thing. My hands shook as I unfolded the legal document that accompanied it. It was a trust, filed and notarized years ago. It detailed the transfer of 90% of the company, shares my father had retained when he stepped down. The trust had held them silently, securely, until the exact day I turned 30, at which point full ownership and voting rights were to pass directly to me. 90%. Enough not only to make decisions, but to change the entire course of the company. I sat frozen, the enormity of it sinking in. Not just the power, but the foresight. My father hadn't just left me a gift. He'd left me the means to protect what he built, and what I had tried so hard to preserve from within. Nathan thought he had removed a manager. What he'd actually done was activate an owner. And I wasn't going to waste the opportunity. The first person I called, after the shock wore off, was Gerald Whitman, my father's longtime attorney, and the man who had managed the trust for over 2 decades. He answered on the second ring, calm and collected as always, as if he had been expecting my call. "Claire," he said, "happy birthday. I assume you've opened the envelope." I could still hear the rustle of papers on his end, like he'd already pulled the file labeled with my name. "Is it real?" I asked, my voice low, still not entirely convinced I wasn't imagining the whole thing. "Every line of it," he replied. "Your father set up the trust to be airtight. No loopholes, no disclosures until now. You are, as of this morning, the majority shareholder of Delaney & Co." The name caught in my throat. Delaney & Co. The company that bore our family name but had, over time, felt less and less like something I belonged to. I leaned back in my chair, the letter spread out on the table, the trust document beside it like a shield. "Why didn't he give this to me sooner?" I asked. Gerald hesitated for only a moment. "He wanted you to decide for yourself. To understand what the company had become before choosing to change it. He knew the board might steer it in a direction he wouldn't have agreed with, and he believed you'd see that clearly, once you experienced it without any illusions." That answer hit hard. My father had trusted me, but more than that, he had prepared me. He had let me see the cracks from the inside, and he'd given me the authority to do something about it when the time was right. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. What happens now? I asked. Now, Gerald said. We set the wheels in motion. When you're ready, we'll notify the board, call a special shareholders meeting, and you'll take control. Officially. I didn't answer right away. I needed a few days to think, to prepare, to plan. But one thing I knew for certain, I wasn't going to let what my father built be dismantled by arrogance and ego. I didn't tell anyone at first. Not my friends, not my former colleagues, not even my mother. For 72 hours, I carried the truth in silence, walking through the city with a secret that pulsed in my chest like a second heartbeat. The irony was unbearable. Less than a week earlier, I'd been fired like a disposable asset, told I wasn't fit to lead. Now, I held the power to remove the man who had dismissed me and restructure the entire company from the top down. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. I spent those first few days reviewing everything: financial reports, employee surveys, department performance data, and exit interviews that had never been properly read. The picture was clear. The company had drifted far from the values my father had lived by. Morale was plummeting. Turnover was rising. And worse, good people were leaving. Quietly, without protest, because they believed no one was listening. I knew many of them by name. I had worked beside them, mentored them, watched their efforts be swallowed up by louder, less competent voices. One night, I sat cross-legged on my apartment floor with a half-empty bottle of Cabernet, the trust papers spread out in front of me, and a yellow legal pad in my lap. I started writing. Not strategy, not talking points, just names. People who deserved better. People who had tried to change things and been shut down. By midnight, the list had grown to 23 names, and every one of them had a story. That was my starting point. Not Nathan, not the board, the people. They were the ones my father had believed in. And I realized then that power meant nothing if I didn't use it to lift them. The next morning, I called Gerald again. I'm ready, I said simply. Let's move forward. He didn't ask what changed. He only replied, understood. I'll begin preparing the documents. The shareholder meeting can be scheduled within 5 business days. I hung up and looked out my window, the early light of dawn just starting to break. I wasn't walking back into that company as someone begging for a second chance. I was coming back to reclaim what should never have been taken. The next few days were a blur of quiet planning. I met with Gerald in his office downtown, a tall building tucked between a boutique hotel and a law firm that probably billed more by the hour than I'd earned in a month. He walked me through every step of the process. How we'd file the motion to call a shareholder meeting, how we'd structure the agenda to include a leadership review, and how, with my controlling stake, no second vote would be necessary. It was all straightforward in legal terms, but the weight of it pressed into my chest like a loaded anchor. Gerald was methodical, his manner calm and precise, but there was an edge of quiet satisfaction in his eyes. He had watched the company deteriorate from the sidelines for years, watching Nathan's name rise while the culture my father built slowly withered. You don't need to announce your ownership until the meeting begins, he told me, sliding a packet of papers across the desk. Let him think he's still in control. The impact will be greater if it lands all at once. I nodded slowly, the logic sound, the strategy sharp. I want to do this right, I said. No grandstanding, no theatrics, just facts and a clean break. Gerald smiled faintly. That's exactly what your father would have done. I left his office with a folder of final drafts and a timeline in motion. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday at 9:00 a.m. Notifications would go out Friday morning, giving the board 2 business days to digest the news. And, in Nathan's case, panic. I spent the weekend preparing. I reviewed every policy he'd manipulated, every complaint he'd buried, and every performance metric that had plateaued under his leadership. I cross-referenced staff turnover with budget increases for executive bonuses. the pattern was undeniable. I wasn't going to attack him with words. I was going to present the truth. Clearly, calmly, and with documents no one could ignore. And when the time came, I wouldn't just walk back into the boardroom. I would walk in as the one person Nathan had never seen coming. The one he never thought to fear. On Monday morning, I met with Caroline Mason, the trustee who had overseen my father's shares since his passing. Her office was smaller than I expected. No skyline view, no dramatic art, just tidy shelves lined with labeled binders, and a small ivy plant curling toward the window. She greeted me with a firm handshake and eyes that missed nothing. "Claire," she said, "I've been waiting for this day for a long time." She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Within minutes, she had spread out a series of files across the table, each one meticulously organized. One contained the original trust paperwork, another held quarterly shareholder reports, and the thickest folder was packed with internal data she'd been quietly compiling for years. Employee satisfaction trends, budget allocations, HR complaints, board meeting transcripts. "I've watched Nathan chip away at your father's legacy brick by brick," she said, her voice low and even. "He masks decline with jargon and inflated projections, but the truth is, he's been bleeding the company slowly, and no one's challenged him because they think he's the only adult in the room." I sat forward, reading a section on executive travel expenses. Lavish retreats, international conferences that yielded no partnerships, and a suspiciously consistent pattern of private charter flights billed as client engagement. Caroline leaned in slightly. "He's not reckless. He's calculated. But he's sloppy with power. He never imagined anyone would audit him from the top down." I nodded slowly, flipping through a breakdown of employee turnover by department. The numbers were staggering, especially in engineering and customer operations, two areas I'd once worked in. "Let the numbers speak," she said. "You don't need to argue. Just show them what's real." She handed me a USB drive containing digitized records of everything. "This will be enough?" I asked. "More than enough," she replied. "It's the story they've been ignoring, and now they'll have no choice but to hear it." As I left her office, I passed a framed photo in the hallway. A black and white image of my father, standing beside the original Delaney & Co. office. He looked young, proud, steady. I touched the edge of the frame gently. "I've got it from here," I whispered. By Thursday night, everything was ready. The documents had been reviewed, notarized, and placed in a sleek leather folder I kept beside me like armor. I didn't sleep much that night, not out of anxiety, but anticipation. I knew exactly what would happen the next morning. Gerald would deliver official notice to the board. An urgent shareholder meeting set for Tuesday. Agenda to include a leadership review and executive reassignment. It was a formal declaration of intent, quiet but undeniable. I didn't announce anything publicly. There was no memo, no social media post, no dramatic confrontation. The silence was strategic. Let Nathan spend the weekend thinking he'd erased me. Let the board believe they were heading into another uneventful quarterly sync. Let everyone get comfortable. I wanted the shock to land clean, surgical. That Friday morning, Gerald filed the meeting notice at 8:01 a.m. I received confirmation 2 minutes later. By 8:30, Nathan would have seen the agenda and realized the walls were closing in. I imagined him pacing his glass office, demanding answers from people who didn't have them. I imagined him brushing it off at first, assuming it was a misunderstanding, until he saw the sender's name on the documents, Claire M. Delaney, majority shareholder. That afternoon, I met Gerald and Caroline at a quiet cafe near Union Square. We went over the final talking points, not because I needed help preparing, but because they wanted to see me step into what was rightfully mine. "He's gonna fight," Gerald warned. "He'll try to cast you as emotional, retaliatory. He'll argue this is personal." "He's not entirely wrong," I said, sipping my coffee. "But I don't need to make it personal. I have the numbers. I have the authority. And I have the truth. They nodded, both of them quiet for a moment. There was no rallying cry, no fist on the table. Just a shared understanding that when Tuesday came, I wouldn't need to raise my voice. I'd let the documents speak. The data, the leadership failures, the silent exodus of good employees. These weren't opinions. They were facts. And facts, presented by the woman no one thought would return, were about to become impossible to ignore. Tuesday morning arrived crisp and clear, the kind of early autumn day that made the city feel alive in a way spreadsheets never could. I dressed with purpose, navy suit, low heels, a simple silver necklace that had once belonged to my mother. I didn't need anything flashy. Confidence didn't require decoration. As I walked through the lobby of the Delaney & Co. headquarters, the security guard gave me a brief, puzzled nod. He clearly hadn't expected to see me again. I nodded back, calm and unshaken. The receptionist, new, probably too junior to know what had happened, smiled politely. "Good morning," she said. "Do you have an appointment?" "Yes," I said, offering only that. Upstairs, the executive floor was already buzzing. Through the frosted glass of the boardroom, I saw silhouettes shifting, papers being shuffled, voices murmuring. Nathan was in there, no doubt holding court, expecting a standard quarterly meeting. He had no idea. Gerald met me outside the door, tablet in hand, expression steady. "They've started?" he said quietly. His halfway through a budget update. I took a breath, straightened the edges of my blazer, and nodded. "Let's begin." When I opened the door, the room stilled, heads turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Nathan, seated at the far end of the table, blinked once and then scowled as recognition hit. "Claire," he said, confused, his voice sharp. "This is a closed meeting, correct?" I replied, walking calmly to the head of the table. "It's a meeting for shareholders and board members." I placed the folder down with care. "Which I am." Nathan rose halfway from his seat, incredulous. "You're not with the company anymore." I looked him directly in the eye. "I'm not here as an employee," I said evenly. "I'm here as the majority shareholder. I hold 90% of the company's voting shares, effective as of last week." A ripple moved through the room. One of the board members, Mr. Levine, an old friend of my father's, reached for the document I had set down. His eyebrows rose. "Is this accurate?" "Yes," I said clearly. "Notarized?" And now officially in effect. For the first time, Nathan looked truly unsettled. The shift in the room was immediate and irreversible. The air, once thick with routine, now crackled with uncertainty. Board members leaned forward, scanning the documents I'd placed before them, while Nathan remained standing, clearly scrambling to regain control. "This is absurd," he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "This has to be a mistake. There's no way her father." "My father trusted me," I interrupted, voice steady but firm. "He saw where this company was headed, and he prepared for it. He left the shares in a trust, protected from dilution, hidden from public records. On my 30th birthday, those shares transferred to me, with full voting rights." Gerald, seated quietly beside the legal counsel, slid another notarized copy of the trust toward the board secretary. "Everything is in order," he added coolly. "Every document filed within corporate governance protocol." Nathan stared at the folder as if it might catch fire. "You don't have the experience to run this company," he snapped. "This is personal, Claire." "A vendetta?" "No," I said, keeping my voice measured. "It's responsible stewardship. I've called this special meeting to review the current executive leadership. Specifically, the role of Chief Executive Officer." The room froze again. Only the sound of pages turning as board members flipped through the supporting data I'd included. 3 years of declining employee morale, spiking turnover, overspending on executive perks, stagnant revenue in a booming market. These numbers speak for themselves. I continued. The company has not grown under Nathan's leadership. It has eroded, quietly, dangerously. I'm not here to argue. I'm here to act. I pulled the final document from the folder and placed it flat on the table. A's the majority shareholder. I am submitting a motion to remove Nathan Calloway as CEO, effective immediately. A few murmurs broke out among the board. The secretary looked stunned. You don't need a second vote. No. I replied. I hold 90%. That is the majority. Mr. Levine cleared his throat, glancing at Gerald for confirmation. The motion stands, he said. As of now, per company bylaws, Nathan Calloway is removed from executive leadership. Nathan's mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time in his career, no one listened. Nathan didn't shout. He didn't plead. He just stood there, jaw tight, face flushed with a mix of disbelief and rage, as the weight of his downfall settled in. For a moment, it looked like he might challenge the board, but then he glanced around the table and saw what I already knew. No one was coming to his defense. The same board members who had once nodded eagerly at every buzzword he dropped were now avoiding eye contact, their silence louder than any vote. Gerald remained seated, calm and unreadable, as if this was just another item on a long legal checklist. You'll regret this, Nathan muttered finally, his voice low but venomous as he gathered his things. I doubt it, I replied without flinching. There was no need to gloat. He had already made himself small, diminished not by my words, but by his own record. As he left the room, the door closing softly behind him, I felt a pressure lift off the room, like a storm had finally passed. For a long beat, no one spoke. Then Mr. Levine looked up at me and offered a faint smile. Welcome back, Claire. I nodded, not out of triumph, but out of responsibility. The work wasn't over. It was just beginning. I didn't rush to occupy the CEO's office. That kind of symbolism didn't matter to me. What mattered was rebuilding the soul of the company my father had created. By the end of the week, Nathan's nameplate had been quietly removed, his parking access deactivated, his files archived. I met with each department head, one by one. Not to assert dominance but to listen. I wanted to hear what they had endured, what they needed, what they'd stopped believing was possible. It was in those conversations that I began to understand just how far things had fallen, and how much hope still quietly existed beneath the surface. People didn't want a savior. They wanted someone who would finally listen, someone who respected the work being done in every corner of the company. That was the promise I intended to keep, starting immediately. In the 2 weeks that followed, I did something most CEOs would never bother with. I walked the floors. Not just the executive wing, but every department. I sat with junior analysts over coffee, joined engineers during their sprint planning meetings, and checked in with receptionists and custodians who had been invisible for far too long. I asked questions. I listened. I took notes. And I paid attention to the names that kept coming up. Not the usual suspects who climbed fast and talked louder than everyone else, but the ones who had quietly kept things from falling apart. People like Dana from the customer service team, who had managed to retain 3 major accounts on her own after her manager bailed mid-quarter. Or James, a brilliant product developer who left 6 months ago after being passed over, twice, for a promotion that went to someone with half his skill but double the charm. I called him and asked if he'd be willing to come back. He said yes before I finished the question. Within days, I began making changes, not dramatic, not flashy, but deliberate. I promoted Dana to head of client retention, the job she'd already been doing in practice. I met with every department lead and quietly reassigned or released the managers who had created toxic microcultures under Nathan's reign. HR was completely overhauled. Complaints that had been buried in backlog were reopened and investigated properly. And then I launched something my father had once only dreamed of: the People First initiative. A company-wide program that prioritized recognition, transparency, and internal growth, open to every role, every level, no matter the title. It was simple. Great work would no longer be overlooked, and good people would no longer be silenced. The change wasn't instant, but it was real. Lauder started returning to break rooms. Desks were decorated again with family photos and tiny succulents. People stayed late not out of fear, but because they believed again. And one evening, as I passed a whiteboard near the developer's bullpen, I saw someone had scrawled in bold blue marker. She came back. Underlined twice. I stood there for a long moment, just smiling. Exactly 1 year to the day since I was fired, I stood in front of the same glass doors I'd once walked out of with a cardboard box and a silent promise to myself. This time, I wore a tailored navy blazer, a leather portfolio tucked under my arm, and a quiet peace that came from knowing I'd done the hard thing the right way. "Good morning, Miss Delaney." The front desk associate greeted me with a smile and a tone that held genuine warmth. "Just Claire," I replied, smiling back. "We're all on the same team." I took the elevator to the top floor, the executive suite that had once been Nathan's domain, and stepped into the office I had waited months to occupy. Not out of vanity, but timing. I hadn't redecorated it to show off. The walnut desk remained, as did the broad window with a view of the skyline. But the photos on the walls were different now. Pictures of our employees, candid shots of product launches, team outings, and the kind of moments that reminded us we were more than a balance sheet. Behind my desk hung a portrait of my father, not as a tribute, but as a compass. I opened my laptop and skimmed the quarterly numbers. Revenue was up, customer satisfaction was up, but what mattered more, retention had soared. Employee referrals were higher than ever, and for the first time, we had leadership that truly reflected the people who built this company day in and day out. A soft knock came at the door. "Come in," I said. It was Dana, now head of client retention. Her smile was wide. "They're ready for you." I followed her down the hall to the boardroom, where half the seats were now held by women, and for the first time, our youngest board member was under 35. After the meeting, I took the long way back to my office, stopping by departments like I used to when no one knew my name. In the break room, someone offered me a cupcake. I took it, sat down, and laughed about nothing important. Because power didn't matter to me. Belonging did, and finally we all belonged. Sometimes, what feels like a setback is actually a setup for something greater. Being underestimated doesn't mean you lack value. It means your strength hasn't been seen yet. Real power often grows in silence, with patience and purpose. You don't need to prove yourself to people who refuse to see you. Just focus, rise, and let your actions speak louder than their doubts. If you've ever turned a moment of rejection into something powerful, share your story in the comments. And if this message resonated with you, consider subscribing for more stories that remind you of your worth.